in order to put the propaganda model to a test, we didn't call it the propaganda model then, it's the same thing. In order to put it to a test, we tried to compare sort of paired historical incidents, kind of like I was doing in connection with the freedom of press issue. I mean, history doesn't create exact controlled experiments, but there are enough cases that are similar enough so you can test how the media are going to deal with them. And we looked for such cases. We looked for atrocities. And we divided the atrocities we looked at into three categories. What we called constructive bloodbaths, meaning ones that are good for U.S. power and the corporate class, so they're constructive. Benign bloodbaths, one where U.S. power and privilege doesn't care very much one way or another, it's sort of irrelevant. And nefarious bloodbaths. Those are the ones carried out by official enemies. So we had various types of benign, constructive, and nefarious bloodbaths. And we gave quite a number of examples of these. Well, our prediction was that the media would welcome the constructive bloodbaths, that they would ignore the benign bloodbaths, and that they would become outraged over the nefarious bloodbaths. And in fact, in the case of the nefarious bloodbaths, they would invent all sorts of fantasies and so on and so forth to make them look even worse than they were. That was the prediction. And we gave a bunch of cases, and we showed that, I think, we tried to show, and I think did show that the predictions were correct. Now, there's actually another prediction that comes out of that model, which we didn't make, but it's implicit if you think about it. And that has to do with the way that this exposure will be responded to. What you'd predict, if you think it through, is that our discussion of the constructive bloodbaths would be ignored, because to reveal the fact that the media welcomed huge bloodbaths, as they did, would not be very conducive to the interests of power or to the media. It would also expose the fraud about the apparent anger over nefarious bloodbaths. So you'd expect the constructive bloodbaths to be ignored. As far as the benign bloodbaths are concerned, you might expect an occasional statement, since it's, I mean, the fact that the media ignored the benign bloodbaths doesn't show such terrible things. It doesn't, at least they didn't applaud them. And as long as you can exclude the role of the United States in being involved in them, not terrible, maybe a few odd comments. With regard to the nefarious bloodbaths, what you'd expect is fury and venom over the fact that the media, that the fabrications over bloodbaths of the enemy were exposed as a fraud. And that's important, and that can be used. It can be used, in fact, to defame the critics. See, if you show that people are lying about the crimes of official enemies, you can easily distort that into a defense of those crimes, right? Like, okay, now what happened? Well, let me take two cases, which were very close. Two cases that we discussed were the slaughter in Timor from 1975 to 1979, and the slaughter in Cambodia in the same years, 1975 to 79. We compared those two cases. The one in Timor we called a benign bloodbath. The United States didn't care much one way or the other. So hundreds of thousands of Timorese get killed. It's not very interesting. The case in Cambodia was, of course, a nefarious bloodbath. That was the bad guys doing it. And we gave a very detailed account of what evidence was available about these two. They're in the same area of the world, the same years, the same time frame. The evidence available was comparable. The slaughters were apparently comparable in scale. The one in Timor was considerably greater relative to the population, but probably roughly comparable in scale. The difference was that in Cambodia it was carried out by the enemy, Pol Pot, whereas in Timor it was carried out by a friend, Indonesia. And furthermore, it was carried out by Indonesia with American arms, which were provided by the Carter administration, which were expanded. The arms flow was expanded by the Carter administration as the atrocities increased. Well, how did the media deal with this? First, fact number one, we went through this in detail. The media dealt with the Timor bloodbaths by suppressing them. There was considerable coverage of Timor, believe it or not, in 1974 and 75. This was all in the context of the breakup of the Portuguese Empire. As Indonesia attacked Timor and the massacre started with U.S. support, coverage began to drop. When the massacre hit its peak in 1978, and it was really approaching genocide with increasing U.S. support, coverage dropped to zero, literally zero. That's the way they dealt with the Timor massacre. What about the Cambodia massacre? Well, within weeks after the Khmer Rouge took power, they were already being accused of genocide by the New York Times. About a year later, they were being accused of carrying out auto-genocide and of having murdered 2 million people. In fact, even of having boasted of having murdered 2 million people. That became the conventional line. There then came a huge outcry ranging from the Reader's Digest and TV Guide over to the New York Review of Books, and including just about everything in between. Vast outcry of outrage over the communist monsters who were carrying out this horrifying bloodbath and so on and so forth. Interestingly, in all of there was a tremendous amount of fabrication, just plain fabrication of evidence. For example, I'll just give you one example. Take this 2 million boast of 2 million killed. You know, that's what everybody's heard. You ask people, how many people had Pol Pot killed by, say, 1977? They'll say 2 million. Here's where it comes from. There was a book published by a French priest, François Panchaud is his name, who's from Cambodia. He wasn't there then, but he knew about Cambodia. He published a book in French. The book was, of course, not available in English. It was in French. It was reviewed by a French journalist named Jean Lacouture. It was reviewed in France. That review was immediately picked up and translated in the United States. It appeared in the New York Review of Books. That's the fastest translation of a review of a French book that's ever appeared. In the review, Lacouture said this. He said, according to Panchaud, the Khmer Rouge boast of having murdered 2 million people, auto-genocide, horrifying, and so on. He gave a whole bunch of quotes from the book about the horrifying things the Khmer Rouge said, and so on and so forth. That was immediately picked up by the rest of the media. It was all over the place, you know, newspaper articles, oh my God, look what they're doing, and so on and so forth. Well, I was curious at the time, because that didn't, you know, I hadn't seen the evidence about that, and I just wanted to know what was going on. So the book was unavailable, so I wrote to friends in France and asked them to send it to me. And I got the book, and I probably was the only person in the United States who had read it, although it was being quoted all over the place on the basis of this review. And I quickly discovered that the whole review was a total fraud. Whatever was going on in Cambodia, that's not what the book said. The book didn't say anything about a boast of 2 million people. The quotes that were given in the review either didn't appear in the book, or maybe you could sort of figure out what they were from, you know, some wording a little bit like them, or they were grossly distorted. And some of them weren't even quotes from the Khmer Rouge. They were quotes from Thai and so on. But and in fact, every factual statement in the review was just totally false. Here's the way the 2 million figure came. Panchaud in the book says that about 800,000 people were killed in the American War, 70 to 75, meaning primarily by American bombing in the war that the United States ran from 70 to 75. That's 800,000 people. He then said that according to the American embassy in Bangkok, 1.2 million had died, not been killed, since the war was over. Well, Lacouture, during the review, just added those two numbers together, called them the Khmer Rouge killings, and then added the boast for good effect. Well, that's where that figure comes from. Anyhow, after I read the book, I wrote a letter to Lacouture, who I know, and I told him, look, I don't know what the facts are about Cambodia, but the relation between your review and the book is zilch. And I think you ought to correct it because your review is being quoted all over the place. Well, he actually published corrections in the New York Review. You know, I said, yeah, he made a couple of mistakes. He said, well, maybe the number killed wasn't 2 million. Maybe it was just in the thousands, he said. A slight difference, you know, a factor of 1,000 difference. But he said, it really doesn't matter, you know, it's terrible anyway, and so on. Well, after his corrections appeared, they were dismissed, and people kept repeating the 2 million figure that he invented, almost half of which was attributed to the American War, notice. Well, that's one example, but it's just typical. If you read our chapter on this, you'll see a level of fabrication which, you know, is mind-boggling. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. Now, this had nothing to do with the fact, of course, there was a massacre. In fact, as we pointed out, the massacre was probably comparable to the massacre in Cambodia, which was in Timor, which is a huge massacre. We also pointed out that of all the evidence available, there was one part that was being suppressed systematically by the American press, interestingly. That part was the information given by State Department intelligence. Now, the State Department Cambodia watchers, you know, State Department intelligence, they were the only people with any evidence about what was going on in Cambodia. And they apparently had pretty good intelligence. They claimed to be able to even pick up radio transmissions and all sorts of stuff. And they were giving a totally different story. They said that what was going on, that there was, you know, big slaughter, but they said it was in the tens or hundreds of thousands, and it was not mass genocide, but it was rather mostly harsh conditions and, brutality and so on. That was the position of the only people who knew anything. And that was systematically excluded. It was just the wrong picture. It wasn't bloody enough for the purposes. Well, we went through all of this stuff, the suppression of the Timor massacre, the vast amount of lying about the Cambodia massacres, and we gave that as an example of treatment of paired massacres, where they were both treated. Now, here's the one place where the book was not ignored. What we said about constructive bloodbaths, totally ignored. What we said about Timor, almost totally ignored. To the extent that it was mentioned, the U.S. role was excluded. What we said about Cambodia, however, that elicited a huge new outrage over the fact that we were defending Pol Pot. Well, we were defending Pol Pot by saying that he was carrying out a slaughter comparable to the major slaughter that the United States was backing in Indonesia, and pointing out that, in fact, that was the picture given by American intelligence, the only people who knew anything about it, and then talking about the way this was distorted in the interests of the propaganda system. But that didn't matter. Here, what we were doing was challenging the right to lie in the service of the state, and that's a very important right to maintain. So therefore, the standard view is, and you can read this all over the place now, is that we, or usually it's me for some reason, I don't know why they decide it's me, but we were defending Pol Pot, and sort of apologists for Pol Pot. You take a look back and you'll see that we described it as a major massacre. We said a lot is uncertain, and then just described the facts as they were and compared them with the media fabrications. And you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to expose media fabrications, and the reason why that was discussed, the one part of the book, virtually nothing about Timor ever is discussed. The reason why that one part is discussed is because that can be used by further lies to defame and undermine critics. So therefore that's done. Well, that's the more subtle way in which the propaganda system works. I should say, incidentally, that some of this stuff is really kind of amusing. Those of you who read this stuff will have seen it. William Shawcross wrote a book a little after that, in which he claimed, The Quality of Mercy, it's called, very favorably reviewed all over the press. Everybody fell in love with it. In the book, he claims that there was silence over the Pol Pot atrocities. And then he asked the question, how could this happen? It's called Holocaust in the Modern Conscience. Well, first of all, was there silence over the Pol Pot atrocities? No, there was a vast uproar over the Pol Pot atrocities. That started a couple of weeks after it. At the time when they were being accused of genocide, they had probably killed a couple of thousand people at the most. Within a year, as I said, it was being everywhere from TV Guide and the Reader's Digest over the New York Review, and then it went on like that. A huge chorus of protest. Further, were tons of fabrication. But it's flattering to say, it's useful, it's serviceable to say there was silence. Why is it serviceable? Because if you can claim that there was silence, then you can raise the profound question of why the West was silent over this massacre, and that means from now on we must be even more diligent in exposing the crimes of official enemies to overcome the fact that we were silent this time. So immediately Shawcross is quoted all over the place, and every newspaper is saying, oh my God, we were silent, how could we have been silent, and so on. Then Shawcross goes on to explain the silence. You take a look at his book, he explains the silence. First, this was in the Washington Post, then in his book. He says the reason for the silence, the primary reason for the silence, is the skepticism of the left, primarily me. So in other words, by my skepticism, I silenced all the Western media and governments. It's a lot of power. Furthermore, and remember what that skepticism was. It was a skepticism about documented lies. Furthermore, he cites an alleged statement in a footnote. He doesn't date it or identify the source. There's two good reasons for that. One is that the citation is fabricated. The other is that the source, to the extent that there's a source, it's in a book. It's in exactly this book, which went to press after the fall of Pol Pot and came out almost a year after the fall of Pol Pot. So what he's claiming is that in a book that went to press after Pol Pot was overthrown, and that appeared almost a year after, in that book we succeeded retrospectively in silencing the entire Western media and governments for 4 years. Well, that's, not only were we powerful enough to scare the entire West into silence, but we even could do it by magic. Now that was quoted. that was quoted all over the place with great awe. The point is there's no absurdity so extreme that it won't be quoted with respect if it's useful. And here it's useful for several purposes. One, to protect the right to lie in the service of the state. Two, to undermine and defame critics who you can't answer. And three, to claim that we didn't look hard enough, we were silent over this atrocity. Well, there was an atrocity that the West was silent over. It's the one we documented, Timor. And they were silent over it because the West was doing it, and therefore you're silent over it. That's the real question of Holocaust in the modern conscience, but nobody will discuss that one. Well, these are all examples of more subtle ways of controlling thought, more subtle and complex. That's the aftermath I had in mind. It's a very interesting story. We review it in Manufacturing Consent.